Michael, welcome to eTown.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. So I want to just ask you, what is a megafire? What does that mean?
Well, when I started working on this book, I thought about the term megafire in the way, most of us do. Huge, fast, really, really hot fires. But there's no real scientific definition for what a megafire is. And I started to realize that, those big, huge, hot fires are certainly megafires, but, a small fire that behaves a lot differently than it normally does and destroys a lot of homes or kills a lot of people, threatens resources or endangered species, those can be pretty mega too.
Yeah. And are we having more of them than we used to?
Yeah, some research back in maybe the last 10 years has shown that since the 1970s, we've seen about a fourfold increase in the number of fires and a sixfold increase in the size of fires. So we're seeing more fires since the 60s and 70s and more big fires.
Yeah. And is that because of climate change, or what are the reasons for that?
Well, there are several different reasons and kind of some umbrella topics to think about with that. And one is forest management and what we do with our forests. Sometimes it can deal with, say, harvesting timber, but a lot of times has to do with what we plant in our forests. Some folks may remember a recent horrible fire in Portugal where 60-some people were killed, and they had planted giant eucalyptus plantations. Yeah. Another umbrella topic is development, and we increasingly are living in flammable forests and in mountainous areas that typically have wildfires, and wildfires are part of that ecosystem. So we impact fires in those locations. And then climate is a very big part of the fire picture, and it impacts what we call the fire regime, the way fires behave in various ecosystems and landscapes in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And this situation is getting worse. And is it worse because of those factors you mentioned, or is it also worse because of mostly because of the development in tough terrain that's hard to defend in a sort of big fire that people are building in these burn areas? Is that why we think of them as being so bad?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think of it in the most simple terms, well, nobody would be concerned about these fires at all if there wasn't something at risk that we value. So if we didn't have homes or reservoirs or electrical lines there, we probably wouldn't pay that much attention to them, except for the fact that it might put smoke in the sky. Yeah. So the fact that we've developed into these areas and live in these areas is a huge part of the issue.
Although people were pretty upset when Yellowstone was on fire.
Yeah, people were really upset when Yellowstone was on fire, and I remember that. The senators from Idaho and Wyoming and Montana were outraged and calling for the heads of the leaders of the Park Service. But boy, you went there a few years after those fires, and those forests were a lot more healthy after those fires than they were 5 or 10 years before those fires. And you could see all kinds of new growth. You could see animal species coming back to forests that they hadn't lived in years, because fire is as natural to these woodlands as rain is.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept for people to try to embrace. Fire is as natural. We should think of it almost like rain.
Yeah, and while we have these really big bad fires, there's also a lot of science that shows that we've also had a fire deficit, as they call it, where we put out every wildfire for a century in most of this country, and so a lot of forests need fires to be healthy, and so they become overgrown. A lot of species end up having to move out of those forests because they're not suitable for them to live in anymore. So, one thing that I kind of challenge people to do is to kind of think about your relationship with wildfire and recognize that fire is going to happen in almost any forested landscape. It needs to happen there. And so, rather than thinking about every wildfire as being a disaster, think of it as being a natural process that goes on in these forests, and we need to be prepared for that and think about how we live in these places so that we are living with fire rather than fighting fire.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, that's a in some ways sort of a symbolic shift where we've thought about nature as something that we need to have dominion over, and we need to try to tame it and control it and restrain it in some way. But you're suggesting that we think about fire as what it is, which is a natural process, often started by lightning, often very healthy and natural for the health of a forest. But we just need to sort of change and become in relationship with nature rather than sort of in opposition to nature.
Yeah, certainly, when a fire threatens our homes or a development or a resource that we're really dependent on, we should go and fight that fire. We should try to put that out or steer it away from the things that are valuable, because we do depend on a lot of resources in our mountains and in our woodlands. But most fires that we deal with, are not that threatening and probably are beneficial to that landscape. Soils need fires to be rejuvenated, clears out, the understory of a lot of forests. Many foresters will tell you that fire is nature's garden crew. It comes through and it cleans up this area, and many of these forests will look a lot better a year or two after a fire burns through than they did before that.
In case you just joined us, you're listening to eTown. I'm here with Michael Kodas. You trained as a firefighter, didn't you?
When I started working on Wildfire, I spent one summer where, basically to do the kind of reporting I wanted to do, I had to train and work as a Forest Service firefighter in Wyoming and in Colorado. But the most interesting interaction I had with wildfire early on, the first wildfire I ever saw was actually on the East Coast, and I was a young photojournalist with a scanner in my car, heard about a wildfire and thought, wow, it's going to look like these big mountain fires I've seen pictures of out west, without thinking about the fact that in the East Coast we don't have mountains like that or forests like that. But I got to where I could see the smoke, and I hopped over a couple of barbed wire fences and got to where I could see some guys digging a line around this fire, and that's how you generally fight wildfires, is with dirt rather than water. And as soon as I started to take pictures, I heard this booming voice screaming and cursing, and I looked up and there's a guy about the size of a bulldozer running at me with a badge on. And as it turned out, I had strayed onto the grounds of a prison. And all of the firefighters were prisoners. So this guard tackled me and started dragging me out. And as that happened, the fire blew up, and one of the prisoner firefighters was about to be killed. He was about to be overrun by this fire, and he's running for his life straight at us, and I'm trying to raise a camera and shoot between this guard's legs as he's dragging me out of this happening. And the guard looks down and sees me, and I assume he's going to hit me or put his hand on the lens of my camera or cuff me. He picks me up and he aims me at the action with the guy running for his life, and I'm able to shoot off a dozen or so photos of this guy running for his life. And then the fire dies down, and the inmate escapes with his life, and the guard knocks me back down and starts cursing me again and drags me away. And then I got thrown out of the prison.
Yeah. Unlike the firefighters. Yeah. In general, though, the folks who are fighting fires are not inmates. It used to be there were oftentimes it was college kids in the summertime, right?
Yeah, a lot of college students earn money to pay for college working on wildfires, and that's something that we're challenged with the change in wildfire in this country, in that we're starting to see in a lot of places in the West, California, Colorado, a year-round fire season where you can see bad wildfires that threaten homes and resources in February or March, and those students that used to fight fires in the summers, they're not available then. Yeah. And a lot of the planes are put away for the winter because it's pretty expensive to have them available year-round. So that's a real challenge for our firefighting infrastructure, this idea that we have to think about fires in February and March just as much as we have to think about them in June and July.
And aren't some of the planes and the slurry bombers and things like that, isn't that's a hugely expensive way to fight fires?
It's huge.
And most of that money, most of those expenditures go to private contractors, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk of what we call the fire industrial complex. In the early 1990s, the United States spent about $300 million dealing with wildfire, and that number tops $3 billion now in a bad fire year. Most of that money goes to the private sector, and so there's a lot of people that depend on fighting fires for their income. Particularly aviation resources. But the science shows that, probably no more than a third of retardant drops actually have any impact on stopping a fire. Even back when I was, fighting fire, quite a while ago, we would refer to the retardant drops as CNN drops. They're being done for the television cameras and to show that politicians are doing something about the fire. And, one of the firefighters I worked with said, if that stuff wasn't red, we would have stopped dropping it a long time ago.
Oh, wow. Hey, lastly, before we wrap up, Michael, first of all, I want to just mention, this is a major project to write a book like this. So congratulations on having it come out. The book is called Megafire, and it's available worldwide, I'm sure.
Yep.
I just want to mention briefly, I was talking with Marty Stewart about his connection with the Lakota people. And what was, in your experience and in your research, what did you discern was the relationship between the native peoples here and fire?
Native peoples have a long history with fire, and different tribes used fire differently. They used fire as a weapon against enemies. They used fire to clear out land to hunt and for agriculture. One of the most interesting bits of history that I learned is that certain tribes, like the Cherokee, would burn an area the year before they planned to set up a camp there because bison prefer to eat grass that's growing on recently burned ground. In Kansas, where I grew up in the Flint Hills, ranchers bring cattle from all over the West to graze on Kansas grass because they burn those fields, and a steer that eats on the grass that's growing on land that's recently burned can grow up to 20% more, because it's so much more nutritious. Yeah. And the natives knew that, centuries ago, so they would burn that land and plan to have a village there the next year because they'd know that the bison are going to come and eat right there, and it would shorten their commute. They could plan on where the bison were going to be so that it made their hunting a lot easier.
So this is an issue that we can all learn a little more about. It's not an easy one to talk about in terms of, so we just do this and then we'll solve the problem, because it's kind of a problem of understanding as much as it's a problem of actually the fire itself.
It's a very wicked problem, as we call it. There's no easy solution. But I do think one thing that everybody can do is to kind of think about their relationship with wildfire. Recent studies showed that in the United States, in the last 20 years, about 84% of wildfires were started by humans. And we still have really big fires started by lightning up in the mountains and in remote forests. But the closer you get to development, the more likely that fire was started by us. Arson and say cigarettes thrown out the window are a minority of those. Power lines arcing on a hot day. A huge fire in Colorado was started by sparks off of the rim of a car when it had a blowout. Things like that start fires all the time. And so thinking about the fact that, we're both dependent on fire as a species, and we're fire starters. We're the species that, uses fire all the time and also inadvertently starts fires. So considering that. And the other aspect of that is to, rather than thinking in terms of, oh my God, there was a horrible fire in that forest, I don't want to go there, it's going to be awful, maybe trying to recalibrate the way you see that. Some of the most beautiful forests I've been through are ones that have recently burned and have, amazing new growth and vegetation growing there that hadn't grown there in decades, and species of birds coming back that couldn't live in a forest that hadn't burned recently. So, take a little bit of time to go and visit an area where a natural wildfire is burned and try to see the beauty in it rather than just the destruction.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Michael. Well, thank you for sharing all this with us. Again, the book is called Megafire, and our guest is Michael Kodas. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Michael Kodas, Megafire.
Is there a website, Michael? There will be. Okay.